Let's start with something simple. Imagine your children are trapped in a burning building. What would a good father do? Would he send one of his other children into the fire, or would he go himself? The answer comes immediately: he goes himself. This isn't complex theology, it's basic morality written on every human heart. And we must take that seriously. When Scripture tells us God wrote his moral law on our hearts, that's not a metaphor to ignore when it becomes inconvenient. It means our conscience and Scripture have the same author. They should align, not contradict. If our reading of the Bible produces a God who violates the very moral law he inscribed in us, the problem isn't with our conscience. The problem is with our interpretation. We cannot separate morals from Scripture because they both flow from the same source. Now read the most famous verse in Scripture. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. What does gave mean here? Does it mean God sent someone else to suffer while he remained safe? Or does it mean something else entirely? Which interpretation matches the moral law we just acknowledged, that a loving father enters the danger himself? But John isn't writing in a vacuum. He's a Jewish writer steeped in Hebrew Scripture. So ask yourself, where have we heard this before? Where else do we find a father, an only son, and a sacrifice? Genesis 22, Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah. John is pointing us backward. Look closely at what God says to Abraham in Genesis 22:8. God will provide himself the lamb. Not God will find a lamb, but God will provide himself. The Hebrew grammar allows both readings, but the older, more literal translation reveals something stunning. God is promising to be both the provider and the provision. Let's examine the Hebrew word by word. Elohim, God, plus Yireh, will provide, plus Lo, for himself, plus Haseh, the lamb. The most literal translation is simply, God will provide for himself the lamb, or more directly, God will provide himself the lamb. The reflexive for himself makes it clear. God isn't asking humans to provide sacrifice. God is declaring he will provide the sacrifice for himself, securing it for his own purposes. And what could that mean except that God himself would be that sacrifice? And what happens next? God stops Abraham. He says in effect, no, don't sacrifice your son, I will provide the sacrifice myself. This is the promise. This is the prophecy. God declares he will not demand human sacrifice, he will provide himself as the sacrifice. Fast forward 2,000 years to John 3:16. When John writes, God gave his only son, he's announcing the fulfillment of Genesis 22:8. God didn't send someone else. God became flesh. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us and provided himself exactly as he promised Abraham he would. Suddenly, John 3:16 transforms. It's not describing a distant God sending a separate son to be punished. It's declaring how God loved. By keeping his ancient promise, by entering creation as Jesus, by going into the fire himself. The moral law in your heart, the prophecy in Genesis, and the gospel proclamation all converge on the same truth. God didn't demand sacrifice from us. He didn't send someone else. He provided himself. That's not just good theology. It's the only reading that honors both Scripture and conscience.